The merchant vessel SS Kelmore pitched violently in the North Atlantic swells as I gripped the bridge rail, salt spray stinging my face in the pre-dawn darkness of March 17, 1943. As third officer aboard this 7,200-ton Liberty ship carrying aviation fuel and ammunition to Britain, I had grown accustomed to the relentless gray monotony of Convoy HX 229's eastbound crossing. But something felt different that morning, a tension that seemed to emanate from the very steel beneath my feet. Captain Morrison stood beside me, his weathered hands steady on his binoculars as he swept the horizon for the 100th time since midnight. The convoy stretched ahead of us in neat columns, 41 merchant vessels protected by a thin screen of Royal Navy escorts. HMS Volunteer, our lead destroyer, cut through the heavy seas 2 miles ahead, her signal lamp occasionally blinking orders through the gloom. To our starboard, the corvette HMS Pennywort maintained her station, while HMS Beverly, another destroyer, guarded our port flank. "Third Officer Jenkins," Captain Morrison said without lowering his glasses, his Scottish accent thick with fatigue. "Check the engine room telegraph again. I want maximum revolutions available on a moment's notice." I had served under Morrison for 8 months, through 3 previous Atlantic crossings, and I recognized the edge in his voice. Something had spooked him during the night watch, though he hadn't shared what. The official position reports from Commodore Brooke aboard the Convoy flagship showed our location as approximately 600 miles southwest of Ireland, well within range of German U-boat wolf packs operating from French bases. The radio room crackled with static as our wireless operator, Petty Officer Williams, maintained contact with the convoy commodore. Standard procedure called for radio silence, but coded position reports were transmitted every 4 hours using the naval cipher. Williams emerged from his cramped compartment, his face pale in the red glow of the bridge lighting. "Captain, I'm picking up increased HF/DF activity," Williams reported, referring to the high-frequency direction-finding equipment that could detect German radio transmissions. The escort commander's been triangulating multiple contacts bearing northeast and southeast of our position. Captain Morrison finally lowered his binoculars, his jaw set in grim determination. "How many contacts?" "At least 8 distinct transmission sources, sir. Could be more using different frequencies." I felt my stomach drop. 8 U-boats meant a coordinated wolf pack attack was imminent. The German Kriegsmarine had perfected their tactics over 3 years of Atlantic warfare, using radio communications to coordinate multiple submarines into devastating pack assaults on Allied convoys. A single U-boat might sink 1 or 2 ships before being driven off by escorts. A wolf pack could destroy an entire convoy. "Signal the engine room," Morrison ordered. "Emergency power to the engines. All hands to action stations." The general alarm began clanging throughout the ship as crew members stumbled from their bunks, pulling on life jackets and rushing to their emergency positions. In the cargo holds below, 3,000 tons of high-octane aviation gasoline sloshed in steel drums, while the forward hold contained 500 tons of ammunition destined for RAF bases in England. A single torpedo hit would turn the Kelmore into a floating bomb. As dawn broke gray and cold over the Atlantic, the full scope of our situation became clear. Convoy HX 229 had become strung out during the night as the slower ships struggled to maintain station in heavy weather. Instead of the tight formation that provided maximum protection from escort vessels, we were spread across nearly 20 miles of ocean. The faster ships, including the Kelmore, had pulled ahead in the center of the convoy, while the slower vessels lagged behind in loose formation. Through my binoculars, I could see individual ships clearly. The British tanker Southern Princess loaded with fuel oil, the American Liberty ship William Eustace carrying aircraft components, and the Norwegian freighter Ellen K with a deck cargo of tanks lashed down under heavy tarpaulins. Each vessel represented months of American and British industrial production, desperately needed supplies for the European theater, and the lives of 40 to 60 merchant seamen. At 0847 hours, the first torpedo struck. The explosion erupted from the starboard side of the Liberty ship James Oglethorpe, sailing in column 4 approximately 1,500 yards from our position. A massive column of water and debris shot skyward as the torpedo from U-758, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Helmut Manzek, detonated against the ship's #2 cargo hold. The sound reached us seconds later, a deep, thunderous boom that seemed to shake the very ocean. "Hard a starboard," Captain Morrison shouted to the helmsman. "Emergency speed." The Kelmore's engines responded with a surge of power as we began an evasive zigzag pattern, breaking from our convoy station in accordance with emergency procedures. Around us, 40 other merchant vessels began similar maneuvers, the neat convoy formation dissolving into apparent chaos as each ship's master fought to avoid becoming the next target. The James Oglethorpe was already listing heavily to starboard, her deck cargo of trucks and jeeps sliding into the sea as her crew abandoned ship. Through the bridge windows, I could see tiny figures leaping from her decks into the frigid Atlantic waters. The ship's radio operator was still transmitting on the emergency frequency. SSSS, SSSS, SSSS. Torpedoed in position 52 to 30 north, 32 to 15 west. Abandoning ship, SSSS, SSSS, SSSS. HMS Volunteer immediately began a depth charge attack on the suspected U-boat position, her deck-mounted mortars firing patterns of explosive charges into the depths. The detonations sent towering waterspouts into the air, each explosion designed to crush a submarine's pressure hull through massive underwater concussion. But U-758 had already moved to a new attack position, following standard wolf pack tactics of firing and immediately relocating. At 0852 hours, a second torpedo found its mark. The Norwegian tanker LNK erupted in a massive fireball as U-435, commanded by Oberleutnant Siegfried Strello, struck her amidships with a G7E electric torpedo. The 8,000-ton vessel had been carrying refined petroleum products, and the explosion was visible for miles as burning fuel oil spread across the ocean surface. The blast was so violent that debris rained down on ships over a mile away, including fragments of steel plating that crashed onto our own deck. "Jesus Christ," whispered Seaman Roberts, our youngest crew member at 19 years old. He was staring at the burning wreckage through the bridge wing windows, his face reflecting the orange glow of the flames. Captain Morrison grabbed the ship's intercom microphone. "All hands, this is the captain. We are under attack by enemy submarines. Maintain your emergency stations and prepare for possible torpedo evasion. Gun crews to the ready. We will not abandon ship unless directly ordered." That is all. The Kelmore mounted a single 4-inch naval gun on her stern, manned by a crew of 6 Royal Navy gunners who had been assigned to our vessel under the defensively equipped merchant ship program. These men, led by Petty Officer Thompson, had trained extensively in anti-submarine warfare, though their primary weapon was virtually useless against submerged U-boats. The convoy's escort vessels were now in full action. HMS Beverly, a town-class destroyer commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Grant, was racing toward the last known position of U-435, her 47-inch guns trained on the empty ocean as her crew searched for periscope sightings. The corvette HMS Pennywort had detached from the convoy screen to rescue survivors from the burning tanker, her crew launching small boats into the oil-slicked waters despite the continued submarine threat. At 0901 hours, our luck began to run out. "Torpedo wake bearing green 45, shouted the port lookout, pointing toward a thin white line streaking through the dark water directly toward our ship. The torpedo from U-600, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Bernhard Zermelin, was running at a depth of 8 feet, its wake clearly visible in the heavy seas. The G7A compressed air torpedo was traveling at 44 knots, giving us perhaps 30 seconds before impact. "Hard a port, full astern," Captain Morrison roared, spinning the engine room telegraph to emergency full reverse. The Kelmore responded sluggishly to the helm, her massive bulk fighting against the evasive maneuver. The torpedo wake grew larger as it approached our starboard side, the weapon's programmed course taking it directly toward our engine room. In those eternal seconds, I found myself calculating the odds. A 7,200-ton Liberty ship making an emergency turn against a torpedo traveling nearly twice our maximum speed. The torpedo passed 15 feet ahead of our bow. The weapon continued its run toward the convoy's port column, where it struck the British freighter Corsaro amidships, detonating against her coal cargo with a tremendous explosion that broke the ship's back. The vessel immediately began settling by the stern as her crew launched lifeboats into the heavy seas. "That was close enough to read the serial numbers," muttered Chief Engineer McLeod, who had rushed to the bridge during the emergency. His engine room crew had responded magnificently to the extreme demands of combat maneuvering, pushing the ship's aging steam plant beyond its normal operating limits. But our problems were far from over. The German Wolf Pack was just beginning its coordinated attack on Convoy HX-229. Captain Zur See Rolf Mutzelberg, commanding the Wolf Pack from U-203, had positioned his submarines in a patrol line across the convoy's projected route. As merchant vessels scattered in all directions, individual U-boats were able to close to optimal attack positions without interference from the overwhelmed escort screen. At 0915 hours, U-91 under Oberleutnant Heinz Walkerling fired a spread of 4 torpedoes into the convoy's center columns. 3 of the weapons found targets. The American Liberty ship William Eustis exploded in a shower of aircraft components. The British cargo vessel Kingsbury took a torpedo in her engine room and immediately lost power, and the Dutch freighter Zanland suffered a hit forward that flooded her cargo holds but did not sink her immediately. The ocean around Convoy HX-229 had become a nightmare of burning ships, oil slicks, and desperate survivors clinging to life rafts in the frigid North Atlantic. The escort vessels were overwhelmed, unable to provide adequate protection for 41 merchant ships spread across 20 miles of ocean, while simultaneously rescuing hundreds of survivors from the water. HMS Volunteer had managed to make sonar contact with U-758 and was conducting a systematic depth charge attack, dropping patterns of 10 charges set for various depths. The explosions created massive underwater concussions that could be felt throughout our ship, rattling loose equipment and causing our own hull to vibrate sympathetically. But the German submarines were using their superior underwater speed and maneuverability to avoid the worst of the attacks. "Radio message from the Convoy Commodore," reported Petty Officer Williams. "All ships are to maintain maximum speed and continue eastward course. Individual evasive action authorized. HMS Highlander and HMS Mansfield are being detached from Convoy SE-122 to provide additional escort." The mention of Convoy SE-122 sent a chill through the bridge crew. We had heard radio traffic indicating that a second convoy, consisting of slower merchant vessels, was also under attack by German wolf packs approximately 120 miles to our southeast. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached a critical phase, with German U-boat production outpacing Allied shipbuilding and escort vessel construction. At 0934 hours, I realized the true scope of what we were facing. Through my binoculars, I spotted a periscope breaking the surface approximately 800 yards off our starboard bow. The thin metal tube caught the morning sunlight for just a moment before disappearing beneath the waves, but it was long enough to confirm my worst fears. U-384, commanded by Oberleutnant Hans-Achim von Rosenberg-Gruszczynski, had achieved an optimal attack position and was preparing to fire. "Periscope bearing green 20, I shouted, pointing toward the location. "Submarine on the surface." Captain Morrison immediately ordered another emergency turn, but we all knew it was too late. The German submarine had already calculated our course and speed, adjusting her torpedo-firing solution accordingly. The physics of naval warfare were inexorable. A submerged submarine could position herself for an almost guaranteed hit against a large, slow merchant vessel. The torpedo struck our starboard side at 0936 hours. The explosion lifted the entire forward section of the Kelmore out of the water, crushing the hull plating inward and flooding number 1 and number 2 cargo holds instantaneously. The blast killed 6 crew members outright: Seaman Davies in the forward lookout position, able Seaman Mitchell who was checking cargo lashings, and 4 men in the forward crew quarters who were thrown against steel bulkheads with lethal force. I was knocked unconscious by the concussion and awoke to find myself lying on the bridge deck, blood streaming from a gash on my forehead. The ship's emergency lighting had failed, leaving us in the gray dawn twilight as Captain Morrison shouted orders through a handheld megaphone. "Damage control parties to stations 1 and 2. Engine room, report your status. Radio room, transmit distress signal immediately." Chief Officer Patterson emerged from the chart room, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Forward holds are flooding rapidly, Captain. The torpedo breach extends from frame 12 to frame 18. We're taking on approximately 400 tons per minute. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The Kelmore displaced 14,245 tons when fully loaded, but the massive hole in our starboard side was allowing seawater to pour into our cargo spaces faster than our pumps could handle. We had perhaps 20 minutes before the ship would reach her critical flooding point and begin her final plunge to the bottom of the Atlantic. "Prepare to abandon ship," Captain Morrison ordered with the calm professionalism that had carried him through 30 years of merchant service. "Lower all lifeboats and life rafts. Radio room. Continue transmitting our position until we lose power." The abandonment of a merchant vessel in heavy North Atlantic seas was a carefully choreographed evolution that required precise timing and discipline. Our crew of 42 men had drilled extensively on this procedure, knowing that their lives might depend on executing it perfectly under combat conditions. Boat stations were assigned by watch sections, with specific crew members responsible for launching and provisioning each lifeboat. The Kelmore carried 4 standard lifeboats with a capacity of 25 men each, plus 6 inflatable life rafts that could accommodate an additional 60 survivors. Emergency supplies included water, hardtack biscuits, signal flares, and medical supplies sealed in waterproof containers. As I helped lower the portside lifeboats, I could see the full scope of the disaster that had befallen Convoy HX-229. At least 8 merchant vessels were sinking or had already disappeared beneath the waves, leaving oil slicks and debris fields marking their final positions. The escort vessels were racing between survivor groups, pulling men from the frigid water as quickly as possible while maintaining sonar searches for the attacking submarines. The corvette HMS Anemone had managed to ram U-432, commanded by Oberleutnant Hermann Eckhart, as the submarine attempted to surface for a gun attack on survivors. The collision had damaged both vessels, with the U-boat limping away with a crushed conning tower while the corvette's bow had been stove in by the impact. At 0952 hours, the Kelmore began her death roll. The massive influx of seawater had finally overcome the ship's buoyancy, and she started settling by the bow with an increasing list to starboard. Captain Morrison was the last man to leave the bridge, following the ancient maritime tradition that required the master to ensure all crew members had abandoned ship before saving himself. I found myself in lifeboat number 3 with 11 other survivors, including Chief Engineer McLeod and Seaman Roberts. The boat had been damaged during launching, with a 3-foot crack in the starboard planking that allowed seawater to seep in steadily. 2 men were assigned to continuous bailing duty as we rowed away from the sinking ship. The Kelmore took 14 minutes to sink completely. Her bow disappeared first, pulling the rest of the vessel down at an increasingly steep angle until only her stern remained visible above the waves. The final moment came with surprising suddenness. A massive air bubble erupted from the ship's interior, and she vanished beneath the dark Atlantic waters, leaving only a spreading oil slick and floating debris. In the immediate aftermath, our priorities became brutally simple. Survival in the North Atlantic's killing cold. The water temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected man in less than 30 minutes. Even in our lifeboat, hypothermia was a constant threat as spray and wind chill combined to sap our body heat. HMS Pennywort found us at 1,127 hours, nearly 2 hours after abandoning ship. The corvette's crew pulled us aboard with remarkable efficiency, wrapping us in blankets and providing hot tea while the ship's medical officer treated our injuries. Of the Kelmore's crew of 42 men, 38 had survived the sinking, for bodies were never recovered from the frigid waters. As I stood on the corvette's deck, watching the oil-stained ocean where our ship had died, Petty Officer Thompson from our gun crew approached me. His face was blackened with smoke and oil, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Third Officer Jenkins," he said quietly, "that was the largest wolf pack attack I've seen in 2 years of convoy duty. 8 U-boats working in perfect coordination, hitting us from multiple bearings simultaneously. Jerry's getting better at this." The statistics would later confirm Thompson's assessment. The attack on Convoy HX-229 represented the most successful German wolf pack operation of March 1943, with 13 merchant vessels totaling 93,000 tons sunk for the loss of only one U-boat. The convoy had been scattered across 40 miles of ocean, with survivors picked up by escort vessels and taken to ports in Iceland and Northern Ireland. But beyond the cold numbers lay a more troubling reality that I was only beginning to understand. The German U-boat force had reached peak efficiency in early 1943, with experienced crews operating from secure bases in occupied France. New construction was delivering submarines faster than Allied forces could sink them, while improved German radar and communication systems were making wolf pack attacks devastatingly effective. Convoy SC-122, which had been attacked simultaneously with our own convoy, lost 9 merchant vessels to the same German wolf pack groups. Combined casualties for both convoys totaled 22 ships sunk and over 200 merchant seamen killed or missing. The losses represented a critical blow to the Allied supply line sustaining Britain's war effort. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding the German submarine fleet from his headquarters in occupied France, would later describe the March 1943 attacks as the high point of his U-boat campaign. His forces had achieved what German surface raiders and aircraft had failed to accomplish: the systematic interdiction of Allied merchant shipping across the North Atlantic convoy routes. HMS Pennywort delivered us to Reykjavik, Iceland, on March 20, 1943, after a voyage that seemed to last forever through ice-filled waters and constant submarine alerts. The port was crowded with damaged merchant vessels undergoing emergency repairs, their sides scarred by torpedo impacts and their crews displaying the hollow-eyed exhaustion of men who had faced death in the North Atlantic's killing waters. In the Merchant Navy Club's dingy common room, survivors from multiple convoy battles shared their stories over cups of ersatz coffee and cigarettes that had been donated by American servicemen. The tales were remarkably similar. Wolf pack attacks executed with German precision, escort vessels overwhelmed by the sheer number of submarines, and merchant crews fighting for survival in lifeboats surrounded by burning oil. Able Seaman Roberts, our youngest crew member, sat in a corner writing a letter to his mother in Cardiff. When I approached him, he looked up with eyes that seemed decades older than his 19 years. "Third Officer Jenkins," he said quietly, "how many more convoys like that one can we survive? I mean, if the Germans keep sinking ships faster than we can build them." It was a question that haunted all of us who had witnessed the systematic destruction of Convoy HX-229. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a race between German U-boat construction and Allied shipbuilding capacity, with the outcome determining whether Britain could continue fighting or would be starved into submission. The answer would come in the following months, as improved Allied escort vessels, better radar systems, and increased air coverage gradually turned the tide against the German submarine fleet. But in March 1943, standing on an Icelandic dock surrounded by the wreckage of merchant vessels, that victory seemed impossibly distant. Captain Morrison approached me as I stood watching the harbor activities. His weathered face showed the strain of losing his ship, but his voice remained steady with professional calm. "Third Officer Jenkins," he said, "I've received word from the shipping company. They're assigning us to a new vessel, the SS Benjamin Harrison, a Liberty ship completing fitting out in Boston. We sail from New York in 3 weeks as part of Convoy HX-235". The prospect of returning to the North Atlantic so soon after losing the Kelmore should have terrified me. But I found myself nodding acceptance, understanding that the war's demands left no time for recovery or reflection. Too many supplies were desperately needed in Britain. Too many crews were required to man the merchant vessels that formed the lifeline between America and Europe. "Will you be sailing with us, Captain?" I asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gray waters of Reykjavik harbor. "I've been sailing these waters for 30 years, lad. Seen them in peace and war, in calm and storm. But what we faced out there with that wolf pack, that was something different, something more dangerous than anything I've experienced." He paused, then continued with characteristic understatement. "But yes, I'll be sailing with you. Someone needs to get those supplies through to the lads fighting in Europe. Might as well be us." Over the following days, as we waited for transportation back to North America, reports filtered in about the continuing Battle of the Atlantic. Convoy ONS-5, consisting of 43 merchant vessels, had fought a running battle with 30 German U-boats for 7 days in early May 1943. The convoy had lost 13 ships, but the escort vessels had sunk 6 U-boats in return, an exchange rate that finally began to favor the Allied cause. The turning point came with the introduction of escort aircraft carriers, improved sonar systems, and centimetric radar that could detect surface submarines at ranges previously impossible. Long-range patrol aircraft operating from bases in Iceland, Northern Ireland, and Newfoundland began closing the mid-Atlantic gap, where convoys had previously operated beyond land-based air cover. By late 1943, German U-boat losses began exceeding new construction, forcing Admiral Donitz to acknowledge that his submarine campaign could no longer achieve decisive results. The wolf pack tactics that had been so devastatingly effective in early 1943 became increasingly suicidal as Allied anti-submarine warfare reached new levels of sophistication. But these developments lay in the future as I stood on the deck of HMS Pennywort, watching the last oil slick from the Kelmore disappear beneath the Atlantic waves. At that moment, surrounded by the debris of merchant shipping and the survivors of wolf pack attacks, the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic remained very much in doubt. The realization that our convoy had sailed directly into a coordinated wolf pack attack haunted me during the long voyage back to North America. Intelligence reports suggested that German B-Dienst codebreakers had intercepted and decoded Allied convoy routing messages, allowing U-boat command to position their submarines with devastating precision. The Kelmore and her cargo of aviation fuel and ammunition had been just one target in a carefully orchestrated campaign to sever the supply lines sustaining Britain's war effort. Every merchant vessel that failed to reach port represented reduced fuel for RAF fighters, fewer supplies for British factories, and diminished resources for the massive military buildup required for the eventual invasion of occupied Europe. Standing in the Merchant Navy Club's reading room, I studied newspaper accounts of the convoy battles with new understanding of their strategic significance. The headlines spoke of tonnage wars and shipping losses, but behind those clinical terms lay the reality of merchant seamen dying in frigid Atlantic waters, escort crews fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, and supply shortages that could determine the war's outcome. Seaman Roberts approached me with a letter from home, his face showing a mixture of relief and concern. "My mother says rationing's getting worse in Cardiff," he reported. "Meat once a week, 2 ounces of butter per person. The docks are half empty. Not enough ships getting through with cargo." The human cost of the wolf pack attacks extended far beyond the crews of sunken merchant vessels. Every ship that failed to complete its Atlantic crossing represented civilian hardship in Britain, reduced military capability for Allied forces, and strategic advantage for German forces who understood that submarine warfare could achieve what their surface fleet had failed to accomplish. Chief Engineer McLeod joined our informal gathering, his professional perspective adding technical depth to our discussions. "The Germans are building U-boats faster than we're building escort vessels," he observed grimly. Type 7 submarines rolling off the production lines at Kiel and Hamburg, while we're converting destroyers from the last war and commissioning corvettes that were never designed for North Atlantic service. His assessment proved painfully accurate. German submarine construction had reached peak efficiency by 1943, with experienced shipyard workers producing Type VIIC U-boats in less than 1 year from keel laying to commissioning. Meanwhile, Allied escort vessel construction struggled to replace losses while simultaneously expanding to meet the demands of global convoy operations. The technological advantages that would eventually turn the tide against German submarines were still being developed in 1943. Improved sonar systems, centimetric radar, and ahead-throwing anti-submarine weapons existed mainly in prototype form, while convoy escorts continued operating with equipment that had changed little since 1940. Captain Morrison shared intelligence reports that painted an even more troubling picture of German submarine capabilities. "The new Type XXI boats will be faster submerged than most of our escort vessels can manage on the surface," he explained. "Schnorkel systems allowing them to run diesel engines while submerged, and improved battery systems giving them underwater endurance we've never seen before." These advanced German submarines represented a quantum leap in underwater warfare capability that could have rendered Allied convoy tactics obsolete. Fortunately for the Allied cause, The Type XXI program encountered production delays and technical problems that prevented large numbers from entering service before Germany's surrender in May 1945. But in March 1943, facing the prospect of returning to convoy duty after losing the Kelmore to a wolf pack attack, such future developments provided little comfort. The immediate reality involved sailing through waters patrolled by experienced German submarine crews operating from secure bases in occupied France, supported by an intelligence network that seemed capable of predicting Allied convoy movements with disturbing accuracy. The journey back to North America aboard a Royal Navy cruiser provided time for reflection on the broader strategic implications of our experience. Convoy HX-229's destruction had been just one engagement in a campaign that stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Caribbean Sea, involving thousands of merchant vessels, hundreds of escort ships, and submarine forces from multiple nations. The German strategy was elegantly simple: sink Allied merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced, thereby stranding Britain of the resources necessary to continue fighting. Admiral Dönitz calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would achieve decisive results within 12 months, forcing Britain to negotiate a separate peace and leaving the United States to face Germany alone. Allied counterstrategy required protecting enough merchant shipping to sustain Britain's war effort while gradually building up the anti-submarine forces necessary to defeat the German U-boat fleet. The margin for error was extremely narrow. Too many convoy losses would cripple Britain's ability to continue fighting, while inadequate anti-submarine efforts would allow German submarine strength to grow beyond Allied capacity to counter. Our personal experience aboard the Kelmore represented a single data point in this massive strategic equation, but one that illustrated the human dimensions of global conflict. Every merchant vessel that successfully completed its Atlantic crossing contributed to the Allied war effort, while every ship lost to German submarines represented not only strategic setback but personal tragedy for the crews involved. The prospect of returning to convoy duty with full knowledge of German wolf pack capabilities should have been terrifying. Instead, I found it strangely motivating, understanding that our individual contribution to the larger war effort remained essential regardless of the personal risks involved. Petty Officer Williams, our former radio operator, had been assigned to a new vessel sailing from Halifax and approached me with final observations about our experience. "The thing that impressed me most about that wolf pack attack," he said thoughtfully, "was the German coordination. 8 submarines working together like a single weapon system, striking simultaneously from multiple bearings." His technical analysis highlighted the sophisticated nature of German submarine operations by 1943. Wolf pack attacks required precise navigation, coordinated communications, and tactical discipline that demonstrated the Kriegsmarine's evolution into a highly professional underwater force. The random submarine attacks of 1940 to 1941 had been replaced by systematic campaigns that represented naval warfare at its most lethal. Yet the same coordination that made German wolf packs so dangerous also created vulnerabilities that Allied forces were beginning to exploit. Radio communications necessary for pack coordination could be intercepted and triangulated by Allied direction-finding equipment. Submarine concentration areas could be detected by increased sonar contacts and avoided by convoy routing changes. Most significantly, wolf pack attacks required multiple submarines to operate in relatively close proximity, creating opportunities for escort vessels to achieve multiple kills during single engagements. The May 1943 battle around Convoy ONS-5 demonstrated this principle, with Allied escorts sinking 6 U-boats during the extended engagement. As our transport vessel approached Halifax Harbor, I studied the massive concentration of Allied shipping that had assembled for the next series of convoy departures. Dozens of merchant vessels filled the anchorage, Liberty ships, Victory ships, tankers, and cargo vessels of every description, all loaded with supplies desperately needed in Britain and the Soviet Union. The escort vessels represented an international effort: Royal Navy destroyers and corvettes, United States Navy destroyer escorts and patrol craft, and Canadian vessels that formed the backbone of North Atlantic convoy protection. Free French, Norwegian, and Polish naval units added their contributions to the Allied anti-submarine effort. Yet for all this impressive display of Allied naval power, the fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Merchant vessels were inherently limited in speed and maneuverability, making them relatively easy targets for submarines that could approach undetected and fire from optimal positions. Escort vessels could provide protection and rescue services, but could not guarantee the safe passage of individual ships. The mathematics of naval warfare favored the attackers in 1943. A single submarine could potentially sink multiple merchant vessels during a single patrol, while destroying that submarine might require the concentrated efforts of several escort vessels over many hours. German U-boat construction was producing submarines faster than Allied forces could sink them, while merchant vessel losses were approaching the limits of Allied shipbuilding capacity. This strategic balance would shift dramatically during 1943 as improved Allied anti-submarine warfare tactics and technology gradually turned the tide. But in March 1943, watching the oil slick from the Kelmore disappear beneath Atlantic waters, that future victory seemed impossibly distant. The memory of sailing directly into a German wolf pack would remain with me throughout the war and beyond. Not merely as a personal experience of combat and survival, but as a window into the broader strategic forces that shaped the Battle of the Atlantic's outcome. Individual courage and seamanship were essential, but victory ultimately depended on industrial capacity, technological innovation, and strategic planning that extended far beyond any single convoy engagement. Years later, reading historical accounts of the March 1943 convoy battles, I would understand our experience as part of the climactic phase of the Atlantic campaign, the period when German submarine warfare reached its peak effectiveness, just before Allied countermeasures began achieving decisive results. We had sailed into the eye of the storm at the moment when the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic remained genuinely in doubt. But standing on the deck of HMS Pennywort as she delivered us to safety in Reykjavik harbor, surrounded by the survivors of merchant vessels and escort ships, only one thing seemed certain. We would return to sea as soon as possible, carrying the supplies that Britain needed to continue fighting. The wolf packs could sink individual ships, but they could not sink the determination that drove ordinary merchant seamen to face extraordinary dangers in defense of freedom. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue for 2 more years, claiming thousands of additional lives and hundreds of ships on both sides. But the strategic initiative was already beginning to shift, though we could not recognize it at the time. The convoy system that had seemed so vulnerable to wolf pack attacks would evolve into an increasingly effective defense against German submarine operations. My next convoy sailing, aboard the SS Benjamin Harrison in April 1943, would encounter only scattered submarine contacts and successfully deliver its cargo to Liverpool without loss. By the end of 1943, German U-boat losses would force Admiral Dönitz to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, effectively conceding defeat in the campaign that had once seemed capable of winning the war for Germany. But those future developments could not diminish the immediate impact of our experience with Convoy HX-229. For 42 merchant seamen aboard the SS Kelmore, the realization that we had sailed directly into a German wolf pack attack remained the defining moment of our war service, a demonstration of both human vulnerability and human resilience in the face of mechanized warfare's ultimate expression. The North Atlantic would claim many more vessels before the Battle of the Atlantic reached its conclusion in May 1945. But it would never again witness the concentrated destruction that German wolf packs achieved during the convoy battles of March 1943, when experienced U-boat crews operating at peak efficiency came closest to achieving the strategic victory that had eluded German surface forces since the war's beginning. For those of us who survived the Kelmore's sinking, the memory served as both warning and inspiration. Warning of the prices that global conflict demands, and inspiration drawn from the ordinary courage of merchant seamen who continued sailing despite knowing the odds they faced. The wolf packs could sink our ships, but they could not sink the will to continue fighting that sustained the Allied cause through its darkest hours.